All right, so let's also talk education, the uncertainty in the education world, rather. President Donald Trump proposing the Department of Education be eliminated entirely. And just yesterday, Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency cutting more than $900 million from the department that tracks academic progress for students. Now, joining us this morning, Grand Valley State University, Professor Gregory Warson. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. So, of course, there's a lot we can break down, but let's start just from the basics. What exactly is the role of the Department of Education?
Well, at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Education does provide some funding to states, but that funding is not the lion's share of how schools are funded at the state level. The Constitution is silent on education, and so that by definition then is left to the states. However, since 1965, the federal government has played a role with the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act under the Johnson administration. That act got reauthorized over time under names like No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act. And so in Michigan, as an example, the federal contribution to education in our state would be about 13% for this school year.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Thank you for mentioning about that federal funding for. Let's talk about the impact of the locals, though. What is that looking like?
It's going to vary, and so I think the concern about possible changes at the federal level, it just depends on really what the change is and what's the degree of change. There's been conversation about changing the system to block grants and giving the money to the states. If that happened and the funding level was the same, the negative impact wouldn't be as bad. The question becomes, how is that funding level going to be the same? Primarily what the federal government gets involved in is supporting students in poverty and students with disabilities. And so districts that have, to speak generally, districts that serve students in poverty and students with disabilities would feel the greatest impact, the greatest negative impact, if there were a reduction in funding in federal supportive education. Larger affluent districts would not feel nearly the same impact because they don't access as much. The biggest example is title funding. Access as much title funding. Now, theoretically, the number of students with disabilities would be about the same, so they would feel that piece, but they would not feel as much the impact of support for students in poverty.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned those that will be impacted. Citing AP, the social media post from DOGE, Musk's team terminated 89 contracts worth $881 million, 29 of those grants totaling over $100 million. And that's for training, or some training for diversity, equity, inclusion had also been cut. So that's included in what you were just mentioning as well, correct?
I would imagine so. I haven't seen the details of the Department of Government Efficiency recommendations, but I suspect that that's accurate.
Talk more, Professor, about the impacts of these cuts, both locally, state, across the board. I know with the cuts, a lot of changes expected could happen, but talk more about the impacts.
One impact that really I think many find troubling is the potential impact on Head Start preschool programs as a prime example. To really sort of nutshell it, most middle class or even upper middle class households could probably afford to pay preschool tuition and would probably choose to do so. But many folks living at or below the poverty line are not going to be able to make that kind of a choice. Now, the research on the impact of preschool for a child in terms of their success in K-12 is pretty robust. Furthermore, so is my experience, having been an elementary principal for a time. There was a pretty stark difference between a child that had experienced preschool coming into kindergarten and first grade and a child who had not. They're used to school, they're used to how it works. They've had some, initial introduction into basic literacy and math. Those are important things to have happen. If something like that goes away, you're going to see a drop in educational outcomes. I would say certainly across the state, and certainly as an aggregate of the state. But again, the districts that will be the most impacted negatively are going to be those districts that serve students that are on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Basically, it's going to be kids that are in poverty.
Yeah. And speaking of those students in that age group, the lower age group, let's talk about the teachers. This could impact, state already seeing a national teacher shortage. This could also affect the teachers that's already, that aren't there, correct?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. School districts spend about 80 to 85% of their budget on people. It's a labor intensive industry. We know that, and that's true in Michigan. That's true across the country. And as we all know, educators are by no means overpaid, and so it's already a challenge to encourage students at the college level to go into education when there are other fields that they can go into that are going to be a lot more lucrative. At the same time, that communicates a level of respect or lack of respect in terms of how we're able to compensate them. So it really comes down to how can we, what kind of talent are we going to attract to have good teachers in the classrooms with kids. And here again, the research is incredibly robust. The key factor in terms of educational outcomes is the teacher in the classroom. They are without question the most important adult in any school building in terms of having an impact on students.
Absolutely, absolutely there. My last question, in your professional opinion or just expression this morning, what would it mean if the Department of Education is eliminated entirely?
Again, I'll go to the phrase, the cliche phrase, the devil's in the details. So two factors are going to impact it. One is, does the level of federal support stay the same or does it go down? And I suspect, given the current conversations in Washington, it's going to go down. The second issue is going to be those dollars have to be allocated somehow. And so how are they allocated? If they continue to be allocated to support students in poverty and students with disabilities, then I think students are going to will continue to fare okay that fall into those groups. If not, then we're going to see a drop in outcomes.
All right, Professor, thank you so much this morning for just dropping the gems and breaking things down for us this morning. We really appreciate your input.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.